The case of the despicable Joseph Zieler true crime stories. The unfolding horror. It was an ordinary spring morning in Cape Coral, Florida, but nothing about what lay ahead would remain ordinary. The gentle breeze, carrying the scent of salt water from the nearby Gulf of Mexico, wafted through the air as the small, sun-drenched community went about its daily routines. Cape Coral was known for its serene canals, cozy neighborhoods, and the feeling of safety that came from living in a peaceful town. But on this particular day, in one unassuming house, something was about to happen that would shake the community to its core. Detective Sarah Matthews had been with the Cape Coral Police Department for over a decade. She had seen her share of gruesome cases, but nothing could prepare her for the nightmare that awaited. The call had come in just after 10 a.m. A double homicide. The victims, a young girl and her grandmother, had been discovered by a neighbor who had gone over to check on them after not seeing them for several days. When the woman described the scene, Sarah's stomach churned. The moment Sarah arrived at the house, she could sense the dread lingering in the air. The front door was slightly ajar, a thin trail of blood leading from the entrance and disappearing into the darkness of the home. She pulled on her gloves and cautiously stepped inside, bracing herself for what she might find. The scene was beyond anything she could have imagined. The victims, 11-year-old Robin Cornell and her grandmother Lisa Story, had been brutally murdered. Sarah forced herself to focus on the details, despite the overwhelming horror of the crime. Lisa lay crumpled on the floor in the living room, her face a mask of terror, blood pooling beneath her head. In the bedroom, the young girl lay motionless on the bed, her small body bearing the unmistakable signs of a violent struggle. The crime scene was chaotic, indicating that the victims had fought for their lives. Sarah's mind raced as she examined the room. This was no ordinary burglary gone wrong. The brutality, the senselessness of the murders, it all pointed to something far more sinister. Whoever had done this hadn't just killed, they had relished in the violence. She noticed something strange. Among the clutter and disarray, a doll sat on the bed beside Robin. Its glassy eyes seemed to stare into Sarah's soul, sending a chill down her spine. There was something eerie about its placement, almost as if it had been intentionally left behind by the killer, a twisted reminder of the innocence that had been stolen. Outside, the forensic team had begun their work. The neighbors were being questioned, but no one seemed to have seen or heard anything suspicious. The perpetrator had vanished without a trace, leaving nothing behind except a scene of devastation and heartbreak. As Sarah looked around the home, one question kept running through her mind. Who could have committed such an unspeakable act? The day dragged on, the sun dipping below the horizon as the investigation continued. The more Sarah learned about the victims, the more disturbed she became. Robin had been a bright, happy child, full of life. Her grandmother, Lisa, had been a kind, loving woman who adored her family. They were not the type to have enemies, but someone had targeted them, and that someone was still out there. By the time Sarah left the scene, night had fallen. The neighborhood was eerily quiet, the sense of safety shattered. She climbed into her car and sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the case heavy on her shoulders. The killer had made no mistakes. There were no immediate leads, no clear suspects. Whoever had done this had planned it meticulously, and that terrified her. She knew that whoever had murdered Robin and Lisa wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. The elusive predator. As the days passed, the investigation into Robin Cornell and Lisa Story's murders hit one dead end after another. Detective Sarah Matthews had been poring over the crime scene photos, reports, and evidence, trying to piece together any clue that could lead her to the killer. But every angle seemed to lead to a blank wall. The community was shaken to its core, terrified that a murderer was walking among them. Parents watched their children closely, locking doors and windows at night in a way they hadn't before. Cape Coral had changed, and it wouldn't be the same until this monster was caught. Sarah spent hours every day interviewing neighbors, friends, and family members, desperate for any insight into the lives of Robin and Lisa that could shed light on their killer's motive. The frustration mounted, though, as everyone described the victims in the same way. They were beloved, good people. No one could fathom why someone would want to hurt them. The lack of a clear suspect gnawed at Sarah. It felt personal to her. This was her town, her community, and she wasn't going to let this killer get away with such an atrocity. A week passed, then two. And then, just as she began to fear that the case would grow cold, a break came. It wasn't a confession or an eyewitness, nothing that concrete. Instead, it was a fragment of DNA left at the scene. The lab had found it on Robin's bedsheet, a small trace that had been overlooked in the chaos. It wasn't much, but it was something. They ran the sample through CODIS, the national DNA database, and waited. Sarah held her breath as the hours dragged on. She knew that the odds of a match were slim, but she had to hope. The clock was ticking, and with each passing day, the killer could be slipping further out of reach. And then, just as they were about to close up for the night, the call came. A match. The name hit Sarah like a bolt of lightning. Joseph Zieler. Zieler was no stranger to the law. He had a long history of criminal behavior, including charges for burglary and assault. But nothing in his record hinted at the kind of violence he had unleashed on Robin and Lisa. Sarah's gut twisted as she pulled up his file. He had lived in Cape Coral at the time of the murders, just a few blocks from the victim's home. But after the crime, he had vanished, leaving behind only rumors and whispers. The pieces were starting to fall into place. Sarah wasted no time. She knew they needed to move quickly before Zieler realized they were onto him. The more she dug into his background, the more convinced she became that he had been planning this for a long time. He was methodical, calculating, and terrifyingly patient. He had blended into the background, quietly disappearing after committing the heinous crime. But Sarah wouldn't let him disappear again. The confrontation. Detective Sarah Matthews couldn't shake the feeling of dread as she prepared to confront Joseph Zieler. He had evaded justice for years, slipping under the radar as a mere petty criminal, but now they had him, finally. The DNA evidence was ironclad. It tied him directly to the horrific scene in Robin Cornell's bedroom, a scene that still haunted Sarah in the quiet moments of the night. The only thing left was to bring him in. Zieler's last known location was a small, rundown house on the outskirts of town. Sarah and her team moved quickly, hoping to catch him by surprise. Every second felt like an eternity as they drove, the weight of the impending confrontation pressing down on her. She knew they had to handle this carefully. A man like Zieler wouldn't go down without a fight. The SWAT team moved in first, surrounding the house in the pre-dawn hours. The sky was still dark, the streets quiet, and the only sound was the muffled breathing of the officers as they prepared to move. Sarah stayed just behind them, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't help but imagine what it had been like for Robin and Lisa on that fateful night, alone, unaware of the monster who had entered their home. The thought fueled her resolve. Go. The SWAT captain's voice broke through the silence, and within seconds, the door was breached. The team stormed the house, sweeping each room with precision. Sarah followed, her hand on her weapon, her senses on high alert. They found Zieler in the living room, sitting on a stained couch, a cigarette dangling from his lips. His eyes were cold, indifferent, as if he had been expecting them all along. There was no panic, no attempt to flee. He just sat there, staring at the officers as they surrounded him. Joseph Zieler, you're under arrest for the murders of Robin Cornell and Lisa Story, Sarah said, her voice steady, but filled with anger. Zieler didn't flinch. Instead, he took a slow drag of his cigarette, exhaling a cloud of smoke before finally speaking. Took you long enough, he muttered, his voice low and gravelly. Sarah's stomach turned. The arrogance, the lack of remorse, it was worse than she had imagined. She had dealt with killers before, but there was something especially vile about Zieler. He had not only taken 2 innocent lives, but had clearly enjoyed the torment he had caused. As they cuffed him and led him out of the house, Sarah felt a strange mix of relief and disgust. They had him, yes, but it didn't erase the horror of what he had done. She wanted answers. She needed to know why he had targeted Robin and Lisa, what had driven him to commit such a senseless act of brutality. But when she looked into his eyes, she saw nothing but darkness. They transported Zieler to the station, where Sarah would finally get her chance to question him. The interrogation room was sterile and cold, a stark contrast to the suffocating heat of the Florida summer outside. Zieler sat on one side of the table, shackled and stone-faced, while Sarah took a seat across from him. She stared at him for a long moment, studying every detail, his gaunt features, the way his eyes seemed to flicker with amusement, the faint smirk on his lips. "So, Joseph," she began, her voice firm, "you said it took us long enough. Does that mean you've been waiting for this moment?" Zieler shrugged, his handcuffs clinking softly against the metal table. "I knew you'd find me eventually," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Not many guys like me out there, you know." Sarah narrowed her eyes. Why Robin and Lisa? Why them? For the first time, Zieler seemed to consider the question, his gaze dropping to the table. He was quiet for a moment before answering, "Wrong place, wrong time. That's all." "Just like that?" Sarah's voice rose, incredulous. "You brutally murder an 11-year-old girl and her grandmother. And that's all you have to say? Wrong place, wrong time?" Zieler's smirk returned. "It wasn't personal," he said casually, as if discussing the weather. "Just needed to let off some steam." Sarah's hands clenched into fists under the table. She wanted to scream, to demand that he feel some kind of regret, but she knew it was pointless. He was a predator, someone who thrived on causing pain. There would be no remorse. She decided to switch tactics. "The DNA evidence ties you directly to the crime scene," she said, her tone measured. "You left your mark, Joseph. That's how we found you." Zieler laughed, a deep, unsettling sound. "I knew that'd catch up with me one day. Guess I wasn't as careful as I thought." Sarah leaned forward, her eyes locked on his. "Why didn't you run?" Zieler shrugged again. "Where would I go? I've been running my whole life. Figured I'd see how long I could stay hidden. It was a good run, though." The nonchalance with which he spoke sent a chill down Sarah's spine. He had murdered 2 innocent people and lived his life as if nothing had happened, as if their deaths were nothing more than a fleeting inconvenience. But Sarah had what she needed. Zieler wasn't going to give her any answers that made sense because, to him, it didn't matter. The horror he had inflicted wasn't driven by logic or emotion. It was simply an outlet for his sick, twisted desires. The interview ended, and as Zieler was led back to his cell, Sarah sat in the interrogation room, staring at the empty chair. The case wasn't over, not yet. There were still details to unravel, still justice to be sought. But the man responsible for the deaths of Robin Cornell and Lisa Story was finally behind bars. And yet, the feeling of victory eluded her. There was no real closure, no way to undo the devastation Zieler had caused. The trial begins. The courthouse was packed. Reporters jostled for position outside, their cameras flashing as Joseph Zieler was led in, shackled and flanked by armed guards. The media had latched onto the story of Robin Cornell and Lisa Story's brutal murders, and now, the trial of the man accused of committing such a heinous act was about to begin. The public wanted justice. They wanted answers. But above all, they wanted to see the man responsible for so much pain finally held accountable. Detective Sarah Matthews sat quietly in the back of the courtroom, her eyes trained on Zieler as he was seated beside his attorney. She felt a sense of grim satisfaction seeing him there, no longer hiding in the shadows. But as the judge called the court to order, her nerves were on edge. The justice system could be unpredictable, and she knew that despite the mountain of evidence, nothing was guaranteed. Zieler had been clever, calculating. She couldn't shake the fear that somehow, some way, he might slip through their fingers. The prosecution wasted no time. They laid out the case in stark, brutal detail. The DNA evidence, the crime scene photos, the testimony from forensics experts who had painstakingly reconstructed the timeline of that horrible night. As they described the attack, Sarah's mind flashed back to the house, the blood on the floor, the eerie stillness of the room where Robin's body had been found. But it wasn't just the facts that made her heart pound. It was the way Zieler sat there, unflinching, staring straight ahead as if none of it concerned him. He didn't flinch when the images of the crime scene were displayed on the large screen for the jury to see. He didn't blink when the medical examiner testified about the victim's cause of death in gruesome detail. It was as though he had already detached himself from the horror he had caused, as though it belonged to someone else. As the trial moved into its second week, the prosecution called Sarah to the stand. She had been expecting this, but that didn't make it any easier. She had to remain composed, to present the facts without letting the emotions she had carried since the day of the murders cloud her judgment. She took a deep breath as she was sworn in, then sat down in the witness box, her gaze briefly flicking toward Zieler. His eyes were on her, but there was no expression, just that same cold, hollow stare that had unnerved her from the beginning. The prosecutor began with a series of routine questions: her role in the investigation, how she had arrived at the crime scene, what she had observed. Sarah answered clearly, recounting the steps she and her team had taken to piece together the evidence that had led them to Zieler. She described the moment they had received the DNA match, how they had tracked him down, and finally, how they had arrested him. Then came the cross-examination. Zieler's defense attorney, a man named Robert Tully, was known for his aggressive tactics in the courtroom. He was the kind of lawyer who thrived on finding technicalities, on creating doubt where none should exist. And Sarah knew that he was going to do everything in his power to discredit the investigation. Tully stood and approached the witness stand, a smug grin on his face. "Detective Matthews, you've testified that the DNA evidence was crucial in identifying my client as the suspect in this case, correct?" "Yes," Sarah replied, her voice steady. Tully nodded, pacing in front of her. "And this DNA evidence was found on a bedsheet in Robin Cornell's room, correct?"
Correct.
He stopped, turning to face her. "Can you tell the court how long that bedsheet had been on the bed before the murders occurred?" Sarah frowned slightly, unsure where he was going with this. "I don't have that information. The sheet was collected as part of the crime scene, along with other items in the room." Tully's grin widened. "So it's possible that the DNA on that bedsheet could have been there for days, even weeks before the murders took place, correct?" Sarah hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "It's possible, but highly unlikely given the nature of the scene. The sheet had clear signs of struggle and disturbance. But you can't say for certain, can you?" Tully interrupted, his tone sharp. "You can't say for certain when that DNA was left on the sheet, can you?" "No," Sarah admitted, her frustration mounting. She knew what he was doing, planting seeds of doubt in the minds of the jury. It was a classic defense strategy. Tully continued, hammering home the idea that the DNA could have been left there at some earlier time, that it didn't definitively place Zieler at the scene during the murders. Sarah clenched her jaw, knowing that the prosecution would have to counter this line of questioning when they got their chance to redirect. But Tully wasn't finished. "Now, Detective Matthews," he said, leaning on the witness stand, "you've described my client as being cold and unremorseful during his arrest. But I'd like to remind the court that your job is not to judge my client's demeanor, but to collect evidence, correct?" Sarah forced herself to remain calm. "That's correct. But his behavior is irrelevant unless it's backed by solid evidence," Tully snapped. "And while we're on the subject, let's talk about that evidence. You claim my client's DNA was found at the scene, but isn't it true that there were other unidentified DNA samples found as well?" Sarah hesitated again. "Yes, there were some partial, degraded samples that couldn't be matched. So, you can't say for certain that my client was the only person present at the crime scene, can you?" Tully's voice rose, his questions coming fast and sharp. "No, but—" "Thank you, Detective Matthews. No further questions." Sarah felt a knot of anger tighten in her chest as she stepped down from the stand. Tully had done his best to muddy the waters, to create doubt where there shouldn't be any. And while she trusted the prosecution to refocus the jury's attention on the overwhelming evidence against Zieler, she couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease. The trial was far from over, and Zieler's defense was proving more formidable than she had anticipated. As she took her seat in the back of the courtroom once again, she caught a glimpse of Zieler. His eyes met hers, and for the briefest moment, a smirk curled on his lips.